Neil, hi.
Hey Claire, how are you?
Well, I'm just so excited about the Democratic National Convention. How about you?
Definitely, I feel like it was something I might not have watched a couple of weeks ago, but now I can't wait to tune in, given everything that's happened, and I think the enthusiasm that's going to be around all the events.
I think that's right. And of course, it's one of the things the pollsters have been tracking the last 2 or 3 weeks is what we used to call the enthusiasm gap. And now there is no enthusiasm
Uh-huh.
gap in the Democratic Party.
It's remarkable, historically significant, isn't
It
it?
really is. And, it sort of reminds you of, before we had primaries, before presidential campaigns just sort of started after the last one finished. Really, in the 19th century and for most of the 20th century, presidential campaigns were 4 or 5 months long.
Right. I kind of wish we could get back to that, but that ship has sailed, and here we are.
I think that ship has sailed too, but I think parties might want to start thinking about what are the advantages to not actually giving each other so much time
Hmm.
to attack, so much time to freeze the electorate, don't you?
Yes, I think that's probably something that at least is happening in internal conversations. But of course, this is bigger than just the parties themselves. I mean, there's, huge media factors or media structures in place here that drive this in addition to the whole like campaign apparatus in this country. So it feels like a lot would have to be undone to be remade, but who knows?
Yeah, I agree with you. And, I've thought for years, I would actually love to see the bottom line, like how much political advertising actually drives other kinds of things in television news.
Mm,
Because all of these billions of dollars that are being raised, a lot of that's being spent on television and radio and internet ads and so on. And that's got to be a big part of not just the annual budget, but the quadrennial budget of all of these media giants, don't you think?
it has to be, though, as someone who I think most people experience this as a viewer, if you live in any of these key states, you are just so sick of those advertisements by the time it comes the day to vote. I think everyone would appreciate seeing far fewer television ads for
Yeah.
candidates.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, let's get down to it. We've had some developments this week, all of which have been good for the Harris Walsh campaign. New York Times Siena poll has put Harris ahead by 4 points in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. There's some questions about how that poll was done because it shows Harris taking the lead among seniors by double digits. And that's incredibly unusual. So I think we're going to be coming back to this polling in months to come. One of the developments I like best was that Jesse Ventura, the former governor of Minnesota, has endorsed Kamala Harris. He says it's time for a woman to be president. And he said, and I quote, "We men have screwed it up enough." Um, he also chided J.D. Vance for trashing Tim Walz's military service and said, "You don't criticize another veteran under any circumstances." That's also a direct quote. This morning, a poll that I don't think I've ever seen cited anywhere, but it comes from right down the road, which is UMass Amherst, is putting Kamala Harris ahead by 3 points nationally. Now, that's still margin of error, but it's a really big change from where we were, at the end of last month, right?
Right. And as we sort of hinted at last week or talked about a little bit, this is all pre the DNC. So it's going to be interesting to watch those polls, see what sort of bounce comes out of the convention, and then how that holds up over the next month or so.
Yeah, and traditionally that bounce is double digits. And of course,
Hmm.
Trump didn't get any bounce coming out of his convention. Yay. So we're seeing actually this enthusiasm carry something else, which is races that were formerly quite tenuous for the Democrats are getting more positive. This morning, the New York Times reported that Nevada's Democratic Senator Jackie Rosen, her seat was once listed as lean Republican by the Cook Political Report, and it has shifted into the Democratic column by 18
Hmm.
points. And Cook is now saying lean Democrat for that seat. So there seem to be opportunities that are closing. for the Republicans because of the way the Trump campaign is mired in bad news. Um, Also, and this is one of my favorite items of news from this week, RFK Jr. has apparently approached both campaigns, both the Trump campaign and the Harris campaign, offering to drop out and endorse them. So he said he would endorse Trump if he got a cabinet seat. He said he would endorse Kamala Harris if he got a cabinet seat. Trump actually met with him, and the Harris campaign has not returned his call. What do we think about this man?
There's something wrong with him. I mean, clearly that this, and that's true from, his own personal biography, the way he's handled this campaign, the stuff he's talked about. I mean, hitting, the dead uh, uh, bear cub and on and on and on. But this sort of opportunism, I think, is going to strike most Americans as, very obvious of what it is. At the same time, that sort of outreach to Trump perfectly works for him. So should we expect the Trump campaign, or at least Trump, to want to make a deal here? I think that's a very likely possibility.
I think it's a likely possibility too. And of course, we know that Trump doesn't actually ever keep any of the bargains he strikes.
Well, that too.
Um, I think what RFK Jr. wants is to be Secretary of Health and Human Services, which would, of course, put him in charge of America's vaccine programs in a Trump administration.
It's sort of wild, though, that he would want that at this point, because really the opportunity here is for him to be, to continue as this media figure, to sort of coalesce some, social media movement behind him, turn that into some profitable platform, and just, continue to spin conspiracy theories forward to his own financial and personal benefit. But you want to move to DC and be a cabinet secretary when you've had no sort of, traditional professional life that would seem to, make you want to work in a bureaucracy. I mean, that's clearly the seat he wants, but does he actually want to have that role? I would think no.
Yeah, I think no too. We also know that in the conspiratorial MAGA world, the name Kennedy has a particular luster, since
Hmm.
there are a great many MAGAs who believe that JFK Jr. is not really dead. There was one time a couple of years ago when all these people in a town in Texas believed that JFK Jr. was actually coming to their town with
Yeah.
Trump to announce that he would be the running mate. And anyway, but so there's a big Kennedy fixation
Hmm.
in MAGA world. I would say that if Trump does cut a deal with him, that is a sign of desperation.
Absolutely. And I think you are getting that sense from Trump himself and from the campaign that they are worried. And how they handle that worry will be interesting to observe. But I think, given who Trump is and the people who he's brought around him or who remain around him, I think that they may handle those worries with their own desperate moves, such as this, as opposed to, traditional campaign strategy efforts that, you know, most presidential teams would do.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. Now, there is a constituency that has been solid for Trump and grown more solid for Trump. And it's a constituency that's right in your wheelhouse, Neil, which is white evangelicals. And yet, last night, there was a Zoom call of evangelicals for Harris. So there seems to be something happening, unless it's an astroturfy kind of thing, that evangelicals are taking another look at the Democratic Party. What's your sense of this?
Well, on one hand, I think there's something significant about this particular election, and also, um, there's always been a small amount of evangelicals who just are not Trump fans at all. But I also think that it's important to remember that this is an ongoing aspect of modern politics, where there was an evangelicals for Obama movement, certainly evangelicals for Jimmy Carter. This is not, it has happened over and over again. It's always incredibly small. I don't think it ever amounts to anything significant at the national level or even at state level. So though for Carter, it was a different, it did, but that
Hmm.
was a different time. But I think in our modern era, um, I'm not so sure how much we should make of this. I mean, I'm curious what you think, Claire, as a sort of outside observer of this. If you think that this is something that's like indicative of a growing anti-Trump sentiment more broadly, or if this is just, I don't know, a sort of flash in the pan moment that is related more to an excitement about Harris that maybe won't make it to November.
Yeah, well, of course, I've only read about it and talked to a couple of friends. I have one friend who is the dearest friend I had, who was an evangelical Christian, who texted me just the other day to say that she doesn't even tell people she's a Christian anymore because it's so associated with ideas that she finds hateful. And she has always disliked Trump because of how he behaves. So she just tells people that she's a person of faith now. She doesn't even tell people that she's a Christian,
Mm,
which made me really angry that they took that away from her because it was very core to her identity. But it also made me wonder how much of a swap might be going on, that people are actually ceasing to identify as evangelical or going quiet about it.
yeah.
And then other people are coming in because, I mean, we read at least one thing that said that Trump supporters were becoming evangelical and the entryway was Trump.
Right. And what do we even mean by that when we say that they're becoming evangelical? Like they're taking on that identifier for themselves. But are they experiencing what has been historically considered the fundamental condition of calling oneself an evangelical, which is a born again experience, adherence to the Bible as the literal word of God, a set of other belief systems that are sort of narrowly defined, associated with a handful of particular Protestant denominations. No, the folks who are calling themselves evangelicals are not churchgoers. They don't have clear religious beliefs. It's taken on a political identity that these folks recognize as being used in media coverage and political discourse. But that's interesting. That's an interesting phenomenon in itself.
Yeah, I think it is, and of course we have a little micro study, an article I shared from Christianity Today, which is one of our favorite publications, um, in which Lutherans and Catholics in Minnesota said that they did not believe that Tim Walz was a very inclusive person. That they thought that many of the things he had done as governor go directly against their religion, and that really the Christian white Christian vote may be pretty much frozen in place.
I think that that's right. I don't expect numbers to look any different at the end of the day than what they have recently. I think white evangelicals are going to vote overwhelmingly for Trump. Will it be the numbers that we saw in 2020? Maybe not, but it's going to be around there, right? We're talking high 70s, close to 80%, maybe even higher than that, but somewhere in that. And again, that fits within historical patterns. I thought that article was fascinating because it really focused on conservative evangelical Lutherans in Minnesota. And Walsh comes from a mainline, even liberal Lutheran denomination. And so many of the people interviewed in that article, a lot of what they were sort of bristling over was Walls is being held up as this folksy, all American, avuncular type. And we think of him as this radical left governor. And I think, first of all, there's a big assumption that one can't be folksy, avuncular, and radical left, right? That's
Right.
built into their reaction. But clearly, as people who've lived in his state and have strong, positions that are opposed to many that he's taken on these cultural issues, they're not happy with the media rollout that he's been
Right.
given.
Right. No, I think that's right. On the other hand, we had that piece from the Washington Times, which said that evangelicals may not be voting for Democrats, but they actually may not be voting at all. That they said 25 to 30 million white evangelical Christians are eligible to vote, but that it's expected that maybe a third of them would vote. Is that a change, Neil?
Well, I sort of wonder about the reliability of that because, first of all, the Washington Times is a very conservative publication.
Right.
I wasn't really clear what the methodology there was and the evidence they were providing. I do think that what I see as a historian, this ties into something that happens every election cycle, which is a fretting over evangelical turnout. And this is a way to actually boost involvement. So every 4 years, there are leading evangelical activists and famous evangelical pastors who decry the lack of turnout of evangelicals and that we are the last bastion here to save the nation. So we've got to mobilize, we've got to register, we've got to turn up at the polls. And that is just a common sort of mobilizing tactic of this movement that we've been seeing since the 1970s. And so I see that not as a clear analysis of potential voter turnout here, as much as I do, it's part of the sort of activist mobilization that happens every 4 years.
That's interesting. So the apocalypse is coming. Be
Exactly,
ready.
exactly.
Yeah.
And if not, if you don't turn up, one of the things that was interesting in that piece was one of the pastors was apparently preaching. A pretty prominent pastor has stated publicly, if you're not going to vote, you must repent. That this is a sin to not vote. And I think what's significant there is the increasingly high stakes, the high theological stakes that evangelical leaders are putting around one's political participation. If you look at like the evangelical history of the relationship to evangelicals in politics, for many years, for much of the 20th century, it was an open theological question whether or not we should be involved in
Right.
politics at all, right?
Right.
That pretty much goes away once you get to the 80s. But still, there was this notion of we should be involved in politics because it's a sort of Christian obligation to the nation. It's an act of service.
Right.
This new language of like, you're a sinner if you don't vote, and also if you don't vote a certain way,
Right.
certainly not every evangelical pastor is saying that. But that is a discourse that I think is growing and is, that's a significant development that's happening on the evangelical right.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And of course, the Pew research that I'll link to for our viewers says that actually the vast majority of people who have no religion, who are either like openly atheist or more or less secular, that they are overwhelmingly Democrat,
Yeah.
as are the vast majority of Black evangelical voters, which I actually think is interesting. It's just like the absolute opposite of white evangelicals. Black evangelicals are overwhelmingly Democrat, which means it's not a distinction in the reading of the Bible. It's a historical distinction, right? I mean, can you just give us a few sentences on that, Neil?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that I always wish was emphasized more because, and I think, journalists and scholars have been better in the last decade of specifying white evangelicals when for years before that, they just said the evangelicals because
Right.
people woke up and realized that people of all sorts of different, persons of all sorts of different colors subscribe to evangelical theology. But you're right, there's a historical division here that I think is deeply in place. It's a product in large part of how segregated these churches remain, even though we've seen, some movement there, but that Black and white evangelicals do not ever connect in life, let
Right.
alone on Sunday mornings. And so that historical fact, and also I think huge different cultural dispositions, even as they have a shared theology, have aligned them with very different political commitments. The interesting thing was a dozen years or so ago, when same-sex marriage was sort of the leading thing, there was this indication that this actually might shift a lot of Black evangelicals into the Republican camp, right? Do you remember those sorts
I
of,
do.
articles and
Yeah.
conversations? And
Yeah.
I think there was a little bit of, movement at the margins, but it didn't stick. And so I think maybe that's a question I would have for you, is like, why was that the case? Is it because, I don't think it's because there was theological change within Black churches about same-sex marriage, as much as it's just, it was a political issue that was up for debate and then settled, and sort of they've moved on from it, or it's not enough to dislodge them from historic commitments to a Democratic Party that they think on the whole is much more closely aligned with the way that they think, the government should be run.
Right. Well, I think that's absolutely right. And the research that I've done on the Reagan administration, I actually spent a lot of time in their archives, as you have as well. And one of the things that Reagan White House people would do is they would bring in their friends. So they would bring in Black ministers who were friendly to them. But because actually the Reagan administration had a policy basically of not talking about race, like it
Right.
was really not okay to make policy about race. So there was a disconnect. They would bring in friends, but because they were not able to actually deliver anything to those friends, there was no transaction that occurred there. But I do think you're right. I think historically the Democratic Party has simply been much more wedded to Black voters, who I think all historians and political scientists would agree are a pragmatic constituency. And so the pragmatism of Black voters consistently looks to the policymaking that the Democratic Party does, even when that policymaking has been insufficient to the crisis in Black communities.
Yeah, and if we're talking about who is wedded to whom, I'm going to add one more, here, which is that I think historically white evangelicals have been more wedded to the Republican Party than they've been wedded to Black evangelicals. And this is a conversation that, I follow evangelical media very closely, and this is something that comes up over and over again. Racial reconciliation efforts. There have been these different movements through time, and the Southern Baptist Convention and things like Promise Keepers back in the 90s, that made these nods to doing it, and then they never fully develop. A lot of time, most often, they get very much attacked from within, right? Like other more conservative white evangelicals say, why are we obsessed with race? That's woke. That's all those sorts of things. So those moments of connection fall apart. And even as they're tried here and there, ultimately, white evangelicals, their partnership is with the GOP. And that is one that I think emphasizes how politics in a lot of ways have overcome theology, or overtaken theology, even among those for whom, a theological worldview is ostensibly, preeminent.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Well, listen, we're going to keep following this story as we move into the fall. I think there's these sort of tests of, how can the Republicans actually get to Tim Walz? How can they sort of break this illusion that he's just a huggy guy?
Mm.
So we're going to keep on this, but I want to move to a new feature in our conversations, which is going viral. What stories we want to go viral this week? And should I start?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay, so what I want to go viral this week is what made me want to scream and cry as I was looking at this in my X feed, sitting at a stoplight.
Always a
Um,
good sign, right?
Always a good sign. A guy named Stephen Walker, the education reporter for the Sarasota Herald Tribune, was tipped off that authorities at New College of Florida, which is a public liberal arts college in Florida, used to be before it was taken over by the DeSantis administration, that those authorities had thrown away an entire dumpster of books that they had removed from the library, had removed from the Gender and Diversity Center. Um, and, we don't know what all the books were, but I saw a couple of them. One was Martin Duberman's Cures.
Hmm.
Another one was John Boswell's History of Same-Sex Love during the medieval period. So we see the direction that this is going in. I want this to go viral because this is the kind of thing that Trump wants to be left to the states. Okay, he actually wants states to be able to decide what people learn, what people know, what people read, and what books will simply be thrown in the trash. And I was just thinking about like the symbolism of throwing books in a landfill, and I thought, well, actually, it's really hard to burn them. I mean, we actually know from the 1930s you have to work really, really, really hard to burn books, but it has the same symbolism to me. So I'm sending this out over X. I'm going to link to it in our show notes, and I want people to read the story and I want them to follow up on it.
Definitely. I just retweeted or re-X'd or whatever we say these days, images of these dumpsters filled with the books. It's revolting to see. I don't know if I've said this on here before, but as I'm, someone born and raised in Florida and all my family lives there, so I have lots of thoughts about what's happening in my home state and, the absolute terror that DeSantis is. But, when we talk about New College, the takeover of New College, DeSantis said was about opening New College up, right? That it was this overly, liberal, partisan, woke university, and he just wanted to make it a place of open inquiry, freedom, and of course we knew that that's not what the actual project was, but that was the rationale, that was the language they were using to defend what they were doing and changing the board and things like that. Something like this is such a clear assault on, you know, academic, not even academic freedom, but like freedoms every American should hold dear, and such alarming images to see. And so I really think that the pictures here are incredibly important for people to see and to share, because they convey something that I think if you just hear about it, I don't know, it's just something to see those thousands and thousands of books being thrown away. I think that would hopefully make everyone's skin crawl.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Neil, what do you want to go viral this week?
Okay, well, I live with, piles of New Yorkers beside me, and I just randomly pull from them. And apparently, this article I want to talk about was actually not from that long ago, given how big my pile is, but from last fall in the New Yorker, October 9th, 2023. The title online is "The Crimes Behind the Seafood You Eat." I think it's a different title in the actual magazine, but most of y'all will be reading this online, by Ian Urbina. It is about Chinese fishing vessels. And it does so many different things. First of all, it just talks about how Chinese fishing vessels, basically provide all of us, the entire world, with the seafood we eat. And the ones that this article focuses on are squid vessels.
Mm,
So there's a really fascinating history about sort of the rise of squid consumption and calamari, and how that was, a modern U.S. invention to get
yeah.
America, they called it something that people would associate with Italian food. But then it really goes into the human rights abuses that are for those who work on these boats, almost all of whom essentially are enslaved on these boats. They sign these contracts that take them out to sea for multiple years. They're given no medical care, and the rates of death and suicide are just unbelievable, as these people, live in just abject conditions. So that's a horrific part of it, but really worth reading and being mindful of. And another part of this that I found fascinating was these shipping vessels, who, are for these private fishing companies in
Yeah.
China, are really part of the Chinese government's expansion across the globe, because these shipping vessels can go into waters that were Chinese military boats. It would raise alarms.
Wow.
But these boats have been basically capturing data. They're mapping. They're getting information that is all for the purposes of the Chinese Communist government. So there's so much happening in this article, because there's so much happening via these fishing vessels. So highly recommend reading that. Again, it's from last October's New Yorker, and the online title is "The Crimes Behind the Seafood You Eat." So check it out.
We'll definitely link to that. And, part of what's interesting to me about that, Neil, is right now, of course, we have all of these Republican operatives online saying, why is food so expensive? Why is food so expensive? Well, when food is really cheap, somebody's being exploited to produce
Absolutely.
it. And, we need to know more about why prices rose so fast. And there's probably some aspects of that that aren't very nice. But let me just say, when you go to an all you can eat seafood, it's at someone's expense. Just
Uh-huh.
as, if you buy a t shirt for $5.99, somebody got paid 2 cents to make it.
Hmm.
So I think that's worth thinking about, and it's a story we should elevate. So Neil, next week when we talk to each other, the Democratic National Convention will have happened. So we're going to have a lot to catch up on. And viewers, keep a close eye on the Substack. We will keep you posted from this today until next week. And Neil, thanks so much for coming in for this conversation.
Thank you. So fun as always.